Hello, everyone. I am Earl Lewis, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies and Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And on behalf of myself and Dwight McBride, the former president of the New School, I'd like to welcome you to the fifth installment of the Academic Leadership Institute webinar series. ALI has a mission to increase the representation of rising leaders committed to the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also seek to become future presidents and provosts. And we are delighted to say that we have met with success, as many of our alums have gone on to actually reach these and realize their goals. Our primary initiative is the annual ALI residential program. But as a complementary piece to that program, we also offer an annual webinar that engages a broader audience on special topics that are critical to higher education and that bring to the table noted and esteemed leaders from across the academy. Today's webinar topic is sustainability of the current economic model in higher education. And we're delighted to welcome a panel featuring a dynamic set of speakers to really help us understand and appreciate the challenges that higher education is now facing and will face. This panel is being moderated by Dr. Beverly Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College. Before I turn it over to Beverly, I want to thank you in the audience for attending and participating. And in advance, I want to thank the panel for I know what we will learn from their conversations and their insights. And so at this time, Beverly, I'll pass it on to you to formally introduce the panelists and to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's seminar on the sustainability of the current economic model in higher education. As you've heard, I am Beverly Daniel Tatum, and I had the privilege of serving 13 years as the 9th president of Spelman College. I'm pleased to be in conversation today with two panelists who bring valuable insight to our topic, and I will briefly introduce each of them. First, I'd like to introduce Penelope Hunt, Senior Consultant and Managing Principal at Marts and Lundy. Penelope has an impressive background in advancement, spanning 28 years in higher education and the arts, having raised literally billions of dollars over the course of her career at places like Northwestern and the University of Illinois at Chicago. And as a consultant, she's helped many more organizations achieve their philanthropic goals. We will also be joined today by Ted Mitchell, President of the American Council on Education. The American Council on Education, ACE, is the major coordinating body for the nation's colleges and universities, and Ted has served as the president since September 2017. Ted and his team work closely with Congress, the executive branch, and the private sector to develop policies and innovative practices that serve our country's post-secondary leaders. Prior to joining ACE, Ted Mitchell served in the Obama administration as U.S. Undersecretary of Education from 2014 to 2017. Over his long career, he has seen higher education from many angles as a professor, a department chair, a dean, a college president, and as a university trustee. Given that, I'd like to start our conversation with you, Ted. As I just noted in my introduction, you have seen higher education from many different angles in a career spanning decades. As you know, the question of sustainability in the current economic model is not a new question. What is different about this moment that gives this question new urgency? You're on mute, Ted.
I think 3 years in, I'm still trying. There we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Excellent. Beverly, it's great to be here with you. It's an honor to be here with you and Penelope, and thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, I was president of a small liberal arts college, Occidental College in Los Angeles in the early 2000s. the aughts as they were. And we were talking about this issue then, and it continues to be important. So the right question is this just more noise in the environment, or should we really be paying attention to it in a different way? I'm voting on number 2. I think that this moment is different. And let me give you a couple of reasons. We've talked for a couple of decades now about the coming enrollment, the demographic cliff. Well, it's real. And we are looking at the downslope of 18 to 24-year-olds. And that's going to continue for a number of years. It'll tick up a little bit, but then continue its downward march. And you saw the New York Times this morning, birth rates are continue to decline in the developing world, with the US in the lead. So that's one. Second, and I think more pertinent to the time we're in, is that the percentage of high school seniors who indicate that they will go to college immediately after high school is declining. So not only is the general number declining, but the willing participants in higher education are also declining. Now, that's both an answer and a question. Why is that the case? I think that overall, we are in an environment in which there's increased skepticism about the value of higher education. We certainly hear it and feel it in Congress, and sometimes with the executive branch as well. People are wondering whether they are getting literally their money's worth. And so you see lots of rankings and ratings about ROI and to different institutions and different programs. And I think that as that question comes up, people are having a second thought about higher ed. And then I think that the third thing is that funding is decreasing. And sometimes that's real, as in states decreasing their funding to public institutions. That has over 10 years driven more of the cost of college onto the shoulders of families and students. And of course, low-income first-generation students, many of them students of color, bear that burden most significantly. And then finally, I would say that we are also in an environment in which, for the first time, we have the rise of low-cost alternatives. And that's not just the traditional community college sector, which has always been an important part of higher education, but now mega universities who have enrollments of over 100, 110, 120,000 students, mostly online, but who are filling the need for bachelor's degrees as well as associate's degrees. So that combination, I think, really is creating a different kind of moment for us.
I'm going to come to Penelope in a minute, but I want to follow up on what you said. There are several concerns, as we know, and you mentioned the concern about the demographic cliff and all of that. One of the things that I have observed, certainly in my role as former president of Spelman, is what I'm going to call the browning of the college student population. There's an increase of Black and Brown and other students of color, BIPOC students, in the pipeline, though overall the number is declining. And many of those students are Pell eligible, Pell dependent in terms of access to resources. And one of the things that's happening this year, which perhaps has increased the urgency of this conversation, is the impact of the unfortunate rollout of the new FAFSA, leading to many students not perhaps being able to enroll in the fall because they don't yet know what their financial aid situation will be. And I'm just wondering, particularly for those small colleges like the one you led and the one I led, what do you think the impact of all that's going to be?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a disaster. And you can't put lipstick on this pig. It's a serious disaster, and like most disasters, it will be exacerbated by the economic and social circumstance of our students. And so low-income first-generation students have had trouble filling out their FAFSA. There was a technical glitch in just the delivery of the form. Mixed parentage students, one parent is undocumented, have had a real difficulty filling out the form. These things are for the most part fixed, but it has still created a backlog. Our FAFSA, people who have filled out FAFSA are 33% lower this year than they were last year. And think about that. That's not a random distribution of the population. Those 33% are likely to be first-generation students for whom This is a mixed up, crazy Byzantine process to begin with. They're being shut out at the front door and filling out FAFSA. Now we're facing a delay in the delivery of completed FAFSAs to our institutions. And we're speaking today to an audience that probably feels this moment by moment, but institutions will not get the full component of the FAFSA forms until the first week in April. And think about that. That's as opposed to the first week in December.
Right.
And so if we're sticking to a May 1 deadline, low-income students are going to have a nanosecond to receive their offers, try to understand their offers, and make a decision that will affect the rest of their lives. I think it's I mentioned it's a disaster. It is also so unfair to our low-income first-generation students.
Well, there's lots to think about in your opening response. I want to just pause before I turn to Penelope to tell our audience that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions in the Q&A section at about 12:15. We will turn to the Q&A and I will share those questions with our panelists. So as we are talking, if you're thinking of something you'd like to ask, please feel free to put your question in the Q&A section of our Zoom webinar. Penelope, given the challenges that Ted outlined, I know that many institutions, I'm putting my former president hat on here, will be thinking, gosh, I better raise some money for financial aid or whatever else I need, because I am really going to need those dollars in the face of all these challenges. Talk a little bit about philanthropy and how it fits into this conversation of sustainability.
Well, when you think about all the flows, the financial flows that come into a college or university, Ted noted the ones that are declining. Certainly, having been in a state institution in my job previously before Marks and Lundy, I felt very much how the state was no longer supporting capital needs, which is a core component of the concept of a state institution. And we see that resource coming from federally or otherwise publicly funded research, those overhead dollars are very small and not likely to increase. We don't see very many states coming back from the cuts of the last economic downturn. So we look at philanthropy and see that it's essentially the only flow of funds that has no cap. You can only raise tuition and the price of the family's participation so much before you have no market left. But philanthropy is an endless opportunity. The challenge in that is when I started as a fundraiser many years ago, it was very common for high-end supporters, board members, to give unrestricted gifts to their institution because they trusted the president and the administration would use them in the best ways. And I think the last fully unrestricted gift I saw in my career was in the early 2000s from a board member. They do still happen, but not nearly as frequently. So you see examples of extraordinary gifts, like $1 billion to cover medical school tuition, which is essentially an unrestricted gift because that's the core expense of any institution. But today's philanthropists, particularly the large givers, are very mission connected. And they typically have a strategy for their philanthropy, things they're trying to accomplish. And while those may be in the purview of an institution of higher education, they generally are somewhat restricted. And if they're not restricted to financial aid or student support, they don't provide the flexibility to an institution that you might think when you just look at the dollar amount. A major exception to that rule is the large surprise Mackenzie Scott grants. which
Yes.
are fully unrestricted. She shows, well, she does her research, but she shows a great deal of trust in the organization she supports, and she trusts that they have a plan and they will use their funds wisely. When she first started making these gifts, we all hoped that others would follow suit and see the value of this. We certainly haven't seen a large shift in that direction, especially among the highest end gifts. So philanthropy is an answer, but I don't think it's the entire answer.
Yes. You know, when you said that philanthropy is an endless opportunity, that certainly resonates in a very hopeful way,
Right.
to those of us who have been out in the trenches trying to raise funds, to know that there's this endless opportunity.
Mhm.
Nonetheless, one of the things that you mentioned was the intention of donors to restrict, more restricted gifts. And one of the things that I observed during my time as president was that even small gifts were being restricted.
Mhm.
The donor who wants to give you $100 specifically for something, doesn't
Right.
just
Yeah.
want to have it go into the annual fund pot, which of course is from a bookkeeping point of view a nightmare. But but one of those things that we worked very hard on at Spelman was improving the annual participation rate of our alumni,
Mhm.
with some success, I'm pleased to say. But I know that the trend has been in the opposite direction, that in fact, alum support of institutions is also on the decline. Could you talk a little bit
Mhm.
about that?
So alumni participation for most development officers has been the bane of our existence for our entire careers because every year the denominator grows enormously
Yeah.
by adding a lot of people whose likelihood of giving is very low. It's the new graduates. And when you're at a larger university, you're putting thousands of people in your denominator with very little chance that they will also appear in your numerator. So the percentage idea is a frustrating one for fundraisers to chase because it doesn't tell the whole picture. I would say going back to the late 1990s, there were rumbles among the fundraising community to try and get US News and World Report to use something different than alumni participation as an indication of satisfaction. What we see, if we take out the concept of participation and just look at the number of donors, that's a better indicator of how alumni support of an institution is growing. And as a large scale trend, we're seeing fewer donors making larger gifts. And so each college or university has to weigh the pros and cons. Do we increase the level of engagement by getting more and more donors to make even a very small gift? Or do we focus on those who are demonstrating their engagement by moving up? They start their annual giving at $50 and then they go to 100 or 500 or 1,000. Those are hard decisions to make because obviously you want both. But from a development program perspective, those are two different strategies. And most organizations don't have the luxury of extensive resources in their development program to pursue both of those, while they're also trying to pursue major gifts.
Right.
But without a doubt, getting people engaged in giving those smaller gifts leads to something in the future. There was just a study released that confirmed what we've seen for a very long time, which is that the frequency of giving, and most specifically persistent giving, is a major indicator of the likelihood that someone will have a bequest for that institution in their will. It's not how much they've given before. It's that their loyalty runs so deep that they give every single year, even at a very modest level. And they further demonstrate that loyalty with a bequest. And sometimes these bequests from the humble $50 donor are in the millions of dollars.
Yes.
So whichever way you approach annual giving, even though it's small dollars, it's worth pursuing.
Well, as we reflect on both the role of philanthropy and the challenges, it brings me back to the question of who should pay? Meaning, what's the role of government? One of the things you said, Ted, was that, even on Capitol Hill, there's this skepticism about the value of higher education. I am going to say something a little bit cynical, which is to say, it seems to me the more low-income people participate in something, the less value it seems to have. And what we have seen, obviously, is a democratization of education, more people having access. But as more people have access, it seems as though there's less willingness on the part of states and maybe even the federal government, though particularly states, I would say, to support its own institutions. I'm wondering if you could comment on both my cynical observation and also just, what should the role of government be in supporting
Yes,
what is a public good, not just a
right.
private good?
I am with you on your cynical point of view.
Me too.
I think that it is not just correlationally true, but causally true that as the people in power see public money going to other people's children, they become more reluctant to keep the pocketbook open, especially when they carry structural or historical views of Black people, brown people, poor people. And so I think white legislatures have a tendency to underfund programs for non-white people, whether that's healthcare, education, housing, et cetera. And so I think that's a major problem. But I think underneath that is what you mentioned at the end, that we've forgotten that education is a public good. And so, it's become very, very, very transactional. And I think that moving from the idea of higher education or education in general as a public good, which is certainly where we started in the mid 60s. Lyndon Johnson, when announcing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, said the answer to all of our national problems comes down to one word: education. Well, that might have been an overstatement, but that was the perspective, is that education was a way for us to address the really naughty problems of America. And we've moved to this very, very simplistic notion that I pay for a good, or in this case, a service, and that service needs to be worth the money in the marketplace. And that's it. And that's why all of these conversations about ROI are dispiriting in a general way. That's not all there is to education. That's never been what there is. And in some sense, that's never been the primary purpose of education, which has been about educating citizens, creating an economy that's growing, not a knowledge base that fuels all aspects of our economic and cultural life. And I think, Penelope, it feels like philanthropy too has become transactional in the same way. I'm going to give you my $100 to support this one thing that I care about, and you will essentially, it's a contract, not a gift. I give you the money, you pay for that and that one thing. So I'd really like, as the next generation of leaders, I would really like us to take this as sort of the existential problem. I know we talk about existential risk all the time and don't usually mean it, but I think that this is the existential problem in education, is our divorcing education from the idea of common good or social benefit or public good.
What do you think it would take? I'm sorry, Penelope, go ahead.
I worked with a client in a state that I won't name to protect their reputation, where almost half of the state legislators in the state house and state senate did not have a college degree. And you don't have to have a college degree to be elected to state governments. So when you have a body that is to a significant degree unfamiliar with what it means to go to college and have a college degree that you use and that informs your life, are making decisions about colleges and their funding when resources are very, very constrained, it's difficult for higher education to make the case that state dollars should come to large universities with beautiful campuses that look very successful, as opposed to struggling farmers in an agricultural area that's been decimated by whatever has happened there. So it's a complicated message to put forward to a complicated and often not receptive audience.
One of the things that has happened in the world of higher education, of course, and everywhere, was COVID. And, you know, in the last couple of years, and the COVID pandemic obviously was very challenging for colleges and universities, particularly residential ones, trying to figure out, you know, how to manage that. And yet it required a rapid response. Colleges and universities are not known for rapidly responding to things, generally speaking. That is one of the criticisms of higher education, slow to change. I'm wondering, Ted, if you think there are lessons learned from that COVID period that might inform this conversation on sustainability.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I was smiling because I think that the COVID response, university's response to COVID, put to bed that old nostrum that higher ed is slow to respond. You know, the California State University system put over 10,000 courses online in 4 days. And, you know, that's pretty quick. I sort of defy any other public or private entity to do something like that. So we have learned a number of things. I think one of them is that the modality of instruction can be enriched, not just replaced, by a combination of online and in-person instruction. And I think that when you look at the way universities have now continued online instruction in various forms, hybrid instruction in various forms, I think that that's a helpful step. The reason I think it's a helpful step is that it can help us reframe our thinking about institutions inviting students to come to us, as opposed to institutions changing the way they work to go to where students are, literally and figuratively. So I think that we're beginning to think about new ways of attracting and keeping students who aren't the typical 18 to 24-year-old residential student. And I think that's really important. After all, only a third of the higher ed population is 18 to 24 and lives on a residential campus. So already people are voting with their feet for alternative modalities. And I think COVID is helping the traditional institutions move in that direction. And the other thing really at the other side of the spectrum is that I think we developed a very, very sobered sense of the emotional state of the individuals in our care at institutions, whether that's faculty, staff, or students. And I think we certainly have seen an exacerbation of mental health issues in all of those populations, but they were always there. And so I think COVID helped us see things that we hadn't seen before. And I think the fundamental inequalities that our students face, whether it be access to the internet or food insecurity or housing insecurity, COVID shined a very bright spotlight on those. And so I think we have been, I hope that we have turned to some of the more basic Maslow's hierarchy pieces of the work that we do with our students and our faculty and our staff, having to do with the basic human needs that we all have, and our responsibility as institutions to help with that.
And
Thank
Beverly,
you. Yes, please.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is the role of governance in the financial health or ill health of an institution. We saw during COVID that as institutions started to emerge from the severest period of shutdowns and quarantines and so forth, the institutions that came back faster were those with the strongest boards.
Mhm.
And a crisis like the pandemic exposed the cracks in the foundation of any nonprofit institution. And if a board was not healthy and well coalesced and of one mind about how to reach decisions and address hard problems, that showed. And I think it is a cautionary tale to any organization to be checking the health of the board on a very regular basis. Because the time to find out you don't have a great board is not when you're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really important point. And certainly I know any presidents on the call will appreciate the importance of having a board that understands its role as,
Right.
governance, not management.
Exactly, exactly. Hey, Beverly, I didn't really directly answer your question about the role of government.
Yeah.
I think that states need to open their pocketbooks. If states really expect institutions to provide the workforce of the next century, they need to be a partner in that. Federal government as well. The Pell Grant, when I was in college in the Stone Age, covered almost 50% of tuition at the average public university, and today it's 20. And so I think that there's a good reason for sort of the economic transactional part of this to become more pressing for students as they pay more of the bill. But we need to help Congress. We need to help our state legislatures see the value in higher education in these more social outcomes in addition to the individual outcomes.
It's very important when you talk about social outcomes to think broadly about what those social outcomes are. And as you were speaking, I thought about the states that are really aggressively pursuing what I'm going to call anti-DEI legislation. Often, as I've been reading about this in the Chronicle of Higher Education and other publications, often those legislators are talking about, we don't want to spend money on this. This is an unnecessary expense, not to mention whatever other attitudinal issues they are addressing or trying to address. But often framing the conversation around, is this worth the money? And what I find short-sighted, many things short-sighted about their arguments, but one thing in particular I find short-sighted is a failure to recognize the value that students gain from learning how to engage effectively with people different from themselves, often facilitated by DEI-related programs or courses, etc., and that the students, the workers of the future, the leaders of the future certainly will be not well served if they haven't had the opportunity to really develop the skill set in their higher ed experience. I'm just wondering, for both of you, I imagine this shows itself up in philanthropy as well. What the two of you might have to say about this current pattern that we're seeing coming out of the state legislatures.
Go ahead, Penelope.
Well, it's bad. I'll start with it's bad, and I think the legislatures are trying to solve a problem we don't have.
Yes.
The legislatures making these kinds of decisions are convinced that that DEI generally is an attempt to brainwash their children and turn them into, I don't know what kind of monsters, but a lot of it is driven by fear of other. And fear of other never helps any organization, society, family move forward in the world. And a major motivation among philanthropists for giving funds for any kind of student support, financial aid, career prep, anything that supports a student. A major motivation is to pay back what someone did for them when they were students.
Mhm.
And if you have someone who is confident they would not have gotten where they are in the world without their education, and they're also confident they wouldn't have gotten an education unless someone helped them pay for it, they're very often looking to help the same kind of kid they were when they went to college. Poor, marginalized in some way, possibly not from a family that understood higher education. Well, the increasing narrowing of what universities and colleges are allowed to do in identifying people, students like that, is absolutely going to have a chilling effect on donors feeling that they can accomplish that by giving to universities. And it's too soon really to tell what the full impact will be of lifting or eliminating the affirmative action options in college admissions. It will, I'm certain, trickle into financial aid policies. And it wouldn't surprise me if it limits how colleges and universities are allowed to direct their aid dollars, which means donors who are focused on students who need an extra hand because of their background may turn to other methods to figure out how to help those students. And it may not be through giving directly to colleges and universities if those institutions aren't allowed to use the money the way the donor hopes to help.
Yes. You know, there was something that you said, Ted, in when you were talking about government support relative to the student of today, right? And you made the observation that, you know, we often are talking about 18 to 24-year-olds, you know, right out of high school going into college, but in fact, just about a third, which means 2/3 are not, right, in that fitting that description. Many more older students in colleges and universities today, now what we used to call, and maybe we should stop calling non-traditional students, um, are becoming the majority. And even as you were talking, Penelope, about the affirmative action conversation and the impact of affirmative action, so much of that conversation has been focused on the very elite institutions, you
Yes.
know, at the top of the food chain, so to speak,
Mhm.
and serving, you know, 1%, if that, of the total student population. I'm wondering what either of you might say about the higher education narrative, which is so often being driven by, you know, what happens at Harvard or Stanford or
Yep.
Yale, when in fact, what's happening for most students is more likely to be going on at the local regional state institution or
Right.
the community college, which is a very different set of circumstances, generally speaking. And what should institutional leaders be thinking about in terms of trying to shift that narrative?
This is you know, sort of, if I had an 8-hour day, which I don't, this would occupy 6 hours of it, because it really it's a very, very vexing issue. Not only is the narrative drawn to the elite and the super elite institutions, but so many of our policies were made in the 60s and the 70s when 18 to 24-year-olds going to residential colleges was all we had, pretty much.
Mhm.
Community
Mhm.
colleges were sort of on their own, but federal policy was always aimed right there. So think, for example, about the structure of the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant supports 18 to 24-year-olds who are full-time students at institutions where they can accumulate more than 12 credits a term. Well, that pretty much takes out every 37-year-old who is working and has kids, who is trying to cobble together or piece together a bachelor's degree. Yet we drive the money as well as our logic toward this very, very and decreasing population of people in these closeted institutions. So I think that we have to direct attention to where the majority of the students are, where the majority of students attend, and the outcomes for the majority of those students. And most of the news is good, but some of the news isn't. We have a completion problem. And going back a couple of times, and Penelope, yes, it's true that every time an institution graduates a class, they create a bunch of alumni, but before that, they've created a bunch of dropouts.
Right.
And that's about 40% of the people who show up at the front door. And so a lot of the narrative problem that we have comes from disappointing people who we've promised success and haven't delivered. This is also where I think we need to recenter the DEI debate, is that we have allowed DEI to be very narrowed in talking about a couple of populations of students who certainly deserve our focus and probably first. But if you talk to a legislator in, let's pick a state, North Carolina, and as some of our presidents do say, wait, when I talk about DEI, I'm talking about poor students, Black students, brown students, and I'm also talking about students with handicaps. I'm also talking about veterans. I'm also talking about women in the sciences. I'm talking about everybody who's got a card or two stacked against them and making it possible for them to succeed. And I think that we need to change that narrative, as well as change the narrative to focus on the big places that where people go. Iowa State, where hundreds of thousands of graduates from Iowa State don't ever get a headline in the New York Times, but they ought to. And so I think working on our storytelling, working with the media, certainly working with policymakers to help them reformulate policy around where students are going and who those students are and what kinds of help they need. In the K-12 world, we talk about IEPs, individualized education plans, right, for special, quote unquote, special needs students. I've long thought that everybody needs an IEP. And I think we're coming to know that in higher education, that's certainly the case. People come from different K-12 backgrounds with different experiences and different sets of curricular opportunities. They come with different family backgrounds, urban, rural. They come from, and so we can't just say everybody is equal when they walk in the front door. Right. Everybody is distinctly not the same. And we need to understand that for all students.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were speaking, Ted, was not just, when you said that going back to the 60s, sort of there was this one model, residential. We know that the residential model is often held up as the quote gold standard, if I might use that language. But having spent the last academic year as the interim president at Mount Holyoke College, a small residential campus, with, a price tag well into the 80s, right? And I was thinking to myself, of course, it's a very diverse student population there and generous financial aid packages available to many students. But, has that model become something that's really just for the wealthy? I remember when I was working as a professor and, tuition, room and board hit like 50,000, we all thought, who's going to be able to pay that? But now the numbers are getting closer to 100,000 on an annual basis. It's, I think we're just 2 or 3 years from that, perhaps. And you do wonder who will be in that market.
Right.
Yeah, it's I'm on the board of a liberal arts college as well, and the three digits past the comma is going to happen real soon. And I would hope that the answer to your question is no. I would hope that institutions would, residential institutions would sort of hold themselves to staying available to a wide range of students. And if we can't do that, we should probably shut down. And that's a hard thing to say, but I will say it. If small colleges can't serve a diverse student body, then they really aren't serving their public mission.
Yeah.
And so they need to rethink their existence. I think that there's also a problem in the state college and university system where the elites and the super elites have become the models, and
Mhm.
everybody wants to be just like Harvard, just like
Yes.
Stanford. And we need to create other ways of aspiring to greatness. And so one of the things we're working on at ACE is the Carnegie classification system. So you'll know the Carnegie classification system has been around since 1960, and it was designed as a descriptive categorization. It's become quite normative. Most universities have somewhere in their sites to be an R1, a big research university. And we've found, as we've been looking at this, that institutions are creating financial pretzels in order to devote more time and energy to research that they believe will take them to R1, often at the expense of student support, scholarships, and faculty, hiring faculty in non-science programs. And so we're relooking at R1, we're relooking at how institutions can signify their excellence. And the thing that we're going to add to the Carnegie classification is a classification based on the social and economic mobility of graduates.
Yeah.
And so now institutions will have something to look at in addition to their research productivity when they compare themselves to their peers. And we're hopeful that creates a different way of looking at effectiveness that will break sort of the homogeneity of the model, not only for 18 to 24-year-olds, but in terms of what happens on these campuses.
Ted, that's such an important issue. I love provosts. I'll share my preferences here. I love presidents too, but a provost and a chief development officer have to be tightly linked for both to be successful. And I've had the good fortune to work with many great provosts, and one of them was Michael Tanner, who went on to work at APL. And Michael once said something that completely shifted my orientation in thinking about the value a university provides. He said, I'm misquoting him, so I hope he's not on the webinar. If he is, Michael, please tell me what you actually said. But he said something along the lines of, the mark of excellence in a university is not the caliber of students they admit. It's the caliber of students they graduate.
Yes.
And the transformational role of that education happens in extreme ways in our what we have typically called regional public universities. And I had my hand slapped recently by the president of one of those, who reminded me that the admissions draw may be regional, but the impact is not necessarily regional. The impact of these universities can be national and international. And they tend to be more focused on helping students, student retention, success to graduation, than they are on reputation, like the traditional large private universities where their reputation is one of their most important outcomes. And I work with a lot of this type of university that is really trying to transform its philanthropy programs. And the more we're able to show people who want to fund change that these are really great places to help fund change, the more they'll be able to solidify their operations and their future, because the more they'll be attracting more philanthropy. And I think that's one of the messages around higher education that we're not projecting loudly enough.
I think that's right, and I think this idea that exclusion is one of the ways you increase your reputation
Right.
has been a part of the poison of the rankings systems.
Yes.
And is one of the ways in which, Beverly, to your question, it really drives kind of the expense model of these places to be seen as the destination for all students, and then to be able to reject 94% of them. That's not the objective. The objective is to include rather than exclude. And for the institutions that are able to achieve that, they can be excellent and inclusive. And that's where I think we're starting to see some models emerge that are very, very encouraging. So that not everybody will look at their Common App and decide that if they don't get into Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, or Stanford, that their life is going to be a waste. That there are plenty of places to go that will provide them with an excellent education that isn't based on excluding people, but on including people.
You know, one of the things that I was thinking about in this context, both in terms of driving enthusiastic philanthropic support and sometimes attracting students to a particular institution, is the role of athletics. And yet, as we think about, you know, athletics, is it a source of revenue? Maybe for a few places it is, but for a lot of places, it's more of an expense. And I remember years ago reading the book, The Innovative University by Chad Christensen, who talked about the fact that this idea that you needed an athletics program goes back to the model, the Harvard model, way back, right? And even today, there are articles being written about, you know, the small college that's trying to save its enrollment picture, launch a football team, you know, draw in those male enrollees. What, and we're also seeing, as sort of part of this broader set of pressures at the moment, this move toward unionization, not only on the part of student athletes, but RAs in the residence halls. And today, I haven't read it yet, there's an article in the New York Times today about unionization at a work college. But let's focus on athletics for the moment. If you want to touch on unions, feel free. But how do we think about athletics as an essential or perhaps non-essential? I will raise my hand. We left the NCAA at Spelman during my presidency, in part because we wanted to invest in wellness for all of our students, as opposed to focusing on intercollegiate competition for just a handful. But, you know, how does that fit into this larger picture of what we think college is supposed to be and what is sustainable?
So Penelope will talk about all of the gifts that are
Yeah.
that are given by athletic supporters. I'll just leave that to you, Penelope. You know, I think I do think that we're in a moment of real transition in college athletics, and I could invent 4 or 5 different scenarios about it. But I do think that going back, whether it was the Harvard model or just sort of the late 19th century idea then of manhood and now of personhood, that there is a place for physical activity, certainly for teamwork. Going back to your point about how do we learn to work with others, having a common project that doesn't start with identity, but starts with being a great softball team or a great volleyball team. National service fits into that same category, by the way. But I think the more we can have activities that bring people together with a common purpose, the better off they will be. But I applaud Spellman's move. I think that focusing on all students and on wellness is the right thing to do. I think Division III athletics in the NCAA framework is the best, even probably better than the Ivy League at thinking about that. But it's, I think that the big money in the Power 5 revenue sports, just like the elite colleges, is driving all the discussion about college athletics. But just like the enrollment pattern, most student athletes are not getting multi-million-dollar name, image, and likeness contracts and aren't planning on playing pro X. They're going to college, and we need to somehow do the same thing with athletics that we've been talking about for higher education. Let's move away from talking about the 2 or 3 shiny objects, and let's talk about what we really started out to do. We really started out to provide a healthy environment for a coming of age population, so that they could learn who they were intellectually, socially, emotionally, and yes, physically. That's the genius of the 4-year residential experience, is that combined coming of age work.
Penelope, is there anything you wanted to add about that? About the
Ooh.
athletics question?
Well, athletics they're such a complex component of the philanthropic income for any college or university, especially in Division One.
Yeah.
That's the most transactional philanthropy you'll find at a university. If it didn't help you get tickets, your annual donation might not be nearly as large as it is. And people will give in exchange for access to tickets, access to parking, advanced tickets to bowl games, all of those things that are really more a commercial enterprise than a philanthropic act.
Mhm.
And that's not so great, but a successful athletics program is incredibly good marketing for those large universities. When I worked at Northwestern, when we had the Cinderella season and went to the Rose Bowl, admissions applications went up, philanthropy, our participation rate went way up. And a lot of that was from people who had never given to athletics before. The admissions, a lot of it came from the fact that we were on TV all the time and everybody was talking about, wow, Northwestern is a smart place that can also play football. So the role of athletics, of those, the big five sports, the role of those in a campus culture and a campus business plan is very complicated. And rarely, in my view, does philanthropy play a robust role in actually advancing those programs. Most philanthropy to athletics is to keep the commercial enterprise in business moving forward.
We're gonna, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and we're gonna shift to that in just a moment. But I want to, this is my last question, and then we'll turn. And it has to do with a conversation that happens in the boardroom. You both made reference to the role of governance and the board. And here's the conversation and how it goes. The president is talking about how we are gonna generate the revenue we need to balance this budget. And, there's the philanthropic sources, the fundraising that's gonna be done. There's the tuition that's gonna be charged. There's the endowment returns, if you've got one, that are gonna help you. If you're public, there's what the state is gonna provide. But then the conversation will turn to, well, what are alternative revenue streams? What are you doing about generating alternative revenue streams? How about a Gatorade invention or something? What are you going to, do we have real estate we could be leveraging? Do we have intellectual property that might generate revenue for the institution? What we need to shift our business model. That's often what the board is saying. And this conversation in some ways started there. We need to shift the business model. But then, a decade later, we got the same business model. 20 years later, we have the same business model because people have not found that magic bullet. I'm imagining there are people on this call who are wondering, what magic bullet would you point us toward? Endless opportunity for philanthropy. Penelope, you told us that was, something to hold out a vision for. But Ted, I know you having lots of these conversations. I'm only imagining. Have you seen something that's working for someone in that shifting of revenue streams or new business model?
Yeah, sure. And I don't want to think of it as a magic bullet, but I think it's important for all kinds of reasons. I think we need to not stand against the demographic wave. I think we need to try to surf it. And we've talked on and off about the different age demographics. We started out talking about alumni and alumni satisfaction. I think we've already got the pieces to to more revenue. And it's a combination of the work of the Alumni Association, the work of extension programs, and the work of any adult education component that we have. We really are missing the boat by not bringing our extension programs into the mainstream and providing them an opportunity to work with alumni to sharpen their skills for a rapidly changing job market. The Alumni Association can be a part of that. So the Alumni Association isn't just asking for money, but is providing continued opportunity. Penelope, my guess is that that's what helps people become annual donors, is that they're still feeling involved and they're getting something from the institution. And then I think in a more strategic and structural way, this idea that there are 40 million Americans with some college and no degree, in a world in which degrees are even more important than they've been in the past, I think gives all of us an opportunity to create ways of building adult education programs that, again, are completely different, but are built on the same intellectual architecture as what we already do. I don't like ideas about, go explore Mars, because we're not good at exploring Mars. What we're good at is providing structured intellectual experiences to individuals who would like to be there. And there are lots of them who we don't touch in our traditional business model.
So this is a question coming to us from our audience, and I think it's really a great question. What metrics or indicators best assess an institution's ability to adapt to changing financial needs? The questioner is asking if we might be able to provide examples of institutions surviving financial crises. So to say it a little differently, just the essence of it, how do you know when you're in trouble? And and what can you do to get out of trouble if you find yourself there?
Trouble comes in a lot of different flavors. And so figuring out how to get out of it requires first figuring out what it is. So my favorite local example is Trinity, Washington.
Yes, that's a great example.
Right, that for many years was an all women's college whose enrollment was declining. And they made a total pivot to being an institution that serves adults who are looking for that degree. Again, focusing on sort of returning women, but making that big strategic focus switch, and they are thriving.
That's a great example. I want to elaborate on it a little bit for people who maybe are less familiar. Having worked in the women's college sector, I'm very familiar with Trinity, Washington. But as I remember it, hearing the president talk about the fact that for many years it was sort of the college of choice for young Catholic women who wanted to be in a women's college. And that population, as other colleges became co-ed, was rapidly disappearing. And yet there it was in the heart of Washington, D.C., with a lot of many low-income older Black women who wanted access to an education, Latinx women who wanted an access to an education, and really did shift its approach from this sort of privileged, majority white community that was disappearing to a readily available, in some ways, population in its own backyard, so to speak, and rapidly becoming known for success there. And, one would argue, well, yeah, but, those are low-income students, so how do they pay? And, there's lots of ways to think about that, people working and going to school at the same time, all those things. But you're right, it's a real success story in terms of both for the students and for the institution.
And I would argue, back to your larger point, it is a social good factory.
Absolutely.
Of really, really massive impact.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Penelope, if you have an example of an institution that turned its fundraising program around, that maybe went from, sort of anemic fundraising to really successful philanthropic engagement.
One of my favorite clients and all-time favorite institutions is the University of Southern Mississippi. So it's one of those state located, very public good, student success oriented universities. And it was a good university with less philanthropic support than it deserved. And when I started working with them, one of the things we did was go out into their donor base and ask questions about what donors would support. And we learned that a lot of the fundraising priorities and messaging were very internally focused. And the alumni and friend donors we talked to said, that's the internal stuff is their job. I want to help them do something that they couldn't do without me. And that's not just their normal business. And so over a couple of years, we reworked the structure of their fundraising program and significantly reworked the way they talked to their external constituents. And at the time we started working with them, we were testing whether they could raise $50 million over a 5-year period. And the answer was absolutely not. And that's not a huge amount of money for a well-established, mid-sized university. As they made these changes, they engaged their philanthropic partners much more deeply. So those potential donors became attached to the idea of helping the university succeed. And last year, I'm so proud of them to say that they completed a $150 million campaign successfully.
Wow.
And that was less than 7 years from start to finish. So really listening to the constituency and saying, we want to hear how we should be doing this and not just assume because we're trained fundraisers, we know how to do it, can make all the difference.
That's a great example. Thanks very much for sharing that. There's a question in our Q&A which speaks to this, the idea that we've been talking about, that the student of today is not the 18 to 24-year-old. The student of today is what we refer to, erroneously perhaps, as non-traditional. And the question is, what mechanisms are in place, maybe some examples, if you have them, of institutions that have really been able to, in a more effective way, accommodate a non-traditional student population. One, in my own mind, I instantly go to the places that are doing, the mega institutions online, right? Because they're reaching out to that non-traditional student population in a very user-centered way. But if you have been that residential campus that is trying to make a shift to reaching out or accommodating a non-traditional age-wise or work-wise student population, are there examples or instances that you might point to that would say, here's a path you might follow?
So we always like to pick up on the elites, but I want to, I'd say go out Harvard as an example of an institution that has created a parallel pathway for adult learners through its extension program that does lead all the way to a Harvard degree. And I think it's small. I wouldn't say it's undersubscribed. I think it's well subscribed, but I would give them credit for, kind of as the epitome of what we're talking about as a 4-year residential institution for making this move. You talked about the mega institutions. I mean, Southern New Hampshire and Arizona State are probably the two best examples. And in both cases, they have not done an either or, but a both and. So Arizona State still has a robust residential student population. It has a Division I football team, blah, blah, blah. And it has this incredible array of online opportunities and offline opportunities for adult learners. So the New Hampshire likewise maintains a small residential campus in Manchester, but has consciously created a program that caters to working adults. And then the final one, which is different because it started this way, is Western Governors University, that adds a twist to it. Western Governors University is based not on course credit, but on competencies. And so think about a mastery learning program amped up all the way through a degree, and you have Western Governors. Now they started brand new, and so they didn't have a lot of the physical and intellectual infrastructure to bend and move. But that's a double example, catering to adult learners in a way, in a pedagogy that is about mastery of concepts and skills rather than about course and seat time.
I would
One of the
put
things,
forward,
Penelope, I'm sorry, go ahead.
sure, I would put forward Upper Iowa University. My knowledge of them is a few years old, so they may not be using the exact same model now, but at the time I knew quite a bit about them. A small proportion of their enrollment was on campus, residential or nearly residential, traditionally aged students. Most of their students were engaged through their satellite campuses that were more like centers, where you would do your education without the expectation of a campus life, because you had a family, or you were married, or you were working a full-time job. And they located those centers around military installments.
Yeah.
So they were providing education to military families, and in some cases, members of the military who were not on distant deployment. And it was taking education to where the students were, as opposed to expecting the students to come to them. They also had an excellent and very broad online program, but I thought that idea of finding a place where you can make a difference,
Yes.
the military, and then going there. They didn't put centers just all over the world or all over the country. They had a target. And my business philosophy, such as it is pick a market and dominate it. So be the place where you go if you are A, B, or C, and serve that constituency or those constituencies so well that nobody in that demographic or constituency definition would want to go anywhere else, because you're the best. And you don't have to be the best at a lot of things. Just be the best at one thing, and that can be a very successful enterprise.
Sounded like you were speaking about Spelman.
Yeah, Spelman is a
and
great example of that. Yeah.
You know, I was also thinking about Morehouse College. Not that long ago, maybe 3-4 years ago, I am a former Morehouse trustee, launched an online program specifically targeted to Black men who might have always wanted to go to Morehouse, or maybe came to Morehouse but didn't finish their degree. It was still in its, just getting started, but it launched quite successfully. I'm sure it's relatively small relative to, the residential campus program, but there was a target market of men who would love to have a Morehouse degree, and creating an opportunity for that to happen was an idea whose time seemed to have come, particularly as people get more and more accustomed to online experiences. I am looking at another question. I think we have time for a couple more. This one is about funding research programs. And it says, I have a question about how to make a convincing argument to get funding for research programs run by experts. How do we attract donors who aren't experts themselves, especially when we want to fund research aimed at the public good? This research focuses on creating big picture changes rather than specific measurable results like direct services do. Could you give any tips or share success stories where someone achieved funding for academic research?
Well, I'll start by saying that private philanthropy for academic research is very challenging because those of us who are not in the academy, civilians, if you will, tend to remember research as when you were in middle school and you went to the library and you pulled out some books and got information from them to write your paper that was due in your history course. Most civilians like me don't really understand what contemporary academic research actually is. And I worked with a dean who suggested that I stop talking about research and start talking about discovery.
Hmm.
And that has come to play in several of my clients' situations where they have a campaign priority for research and it's falling on deaf ears. They shift it to talk about discovery, and they give examples of the kinds of discoveries that have been made by top tier faculty and graduate students and postdocs and so forth. And people get very excited about discovery. So that slight shift of putting it into a place where the philanthropist can relate to it can make a very big difference in garnering funds, especially the private individuals and families giving to research, which is the most flexible research dollars you can raise.
I love
Yeah.
that reframing. Ted, did you want to say more?
I was going to say exactly what you said. The reframing. I mean, research is an activity, so it's a process. It's like but discovery is a thing, and it's an outcome. And so I think that's brilliant. But I guess the other thing that I would say is for the kind of research that the questioner is asking about, in a bizarre way, the bigger the object, the easier it will be to raise money on it. That to have that kind of thing as a small project, I think will not whet the appetite as much as having a center on whatever you think this big topic is, and to draw the philanthropy in pieces rather than as a whole, but having it be a conglomeration of different projects that all have the same objective may be a better way to go.
I have another question in our Q&A here that seems to me also speaks to a reframing opportunity. That's how I'm reading this question, and I'm thinking maybe there's some reframing that could happen here. But here's the question. Institutional change that can help on costs is, as we all know, difficult. So many people need to be aligned, and so many people can decide to block something or slow it down to death. My question is about the quandary, about the reality that presidents are selected and rewarded only for making their institution distinctive, i.e., avoiding collaborative and in some cases cost-saving efforts. Is there anything that we can do to remind boards, search committees, that part of leadership for the sector needs to be some sense of collective well-being of the sector? It's not just about you and your institution, but how do we factor in, this is, maybe I'm adding to the question in a way that the poser has not intended, but it seems to me, how do we think about the bully pulpit, or the voice for the common good that the president of an organization, a college or university, might be?
That's a question not about the president, but about the board.
Board.
Yes.
So I think boards are. Sorry, Penelope, go ahead.
It's the board that decides how the president will be measured and what type of president they want to recruit when there's an opening. And if the board is not thinking about the collective good, then they're likely to set expectations for their president that don't give the president the leeway to be focused on projects or topics that would be for the greater good and not necessarily directly benefiting their own institution.
So I've seen this work both ways with boards. I was I was an observer of a conversation between an institution that could no longer support its football program and a nearby institution that was an on-field rival who wanted to create a combined football program, and a board that said, no, we will never partner with X. Crossed its arms, and its prize was to not have a football team. But I also think that there are increasing examples of presidents who have shown their ability by lowering costs by developing partnerships. And the easiest ones to do are back office partnerships where no one really cares, where your finances are done, or if you're sharing a Salesforce license with 3 other people. And so starting there, proving to the board that collaboration can matter, you can build to other things like sharing curriculum, sharing faculty, doing joint research projects, so that the individual institution is seen to prosper with its partners. And I think whether you're talking about Atlanta or Northampton, Massachusetts, or Claremont, California, there are long-standing examples of sets of institutions that have done that really well, and I expect that there will be more of them.
Consortia for sure can be very helpful in this regard. I think you are quite right, and having been part of one at the Atlanta University Consortium, but also the Associated Colleges of the South and 5 colleges up in Massachusetts. The sharing of curricula, and in particular, even using technology. We haven't talked much about technology as a way to reduce cost or expand. We have a little bit talked about it relative to expanding access with online opportunities. But, as we stand on the dawn of a new age of artificial intelligence, what should how might that impact the sustainability of our institutions as AI expands and technology becomes more and more pervasive?
So looking historically, I don't think that any new technology has ever decreased the
Doesn't make it less expensive, no.
of producing education. And I guess, Beverly, the 3 of us have all seen this for a long time. And so I think AI will change the way we do our work, but I'm not sure that it will have any effect on the business model, other than to potentially separate out the well-to-do institutions from those that can't marshal AI resources to support faculty research, student research, teaching, learning. And that I think we need to watch out for.
What about in the philanthropic world? Is it going to help us raise money?
It can help with engagement because technology can make it easier to reach out to more people, to communicate with them, to encourage them to communicate with you. And the field has benefited from technology like wealth screening and other ways to research donors so that you're more efficient in figuring out who to reach out to. And there are some very interesting AI applications in that part of the business that are emerging that could be very useful to help institutions find the right people to talk to. But the technology is not going to take care of the talking to and the listening and the figuring out and dreaming together that's going to result in that big gift.
And there
We-
will be great fortunes made, and we will need to keep track of where things
That's
are.
right.
Where are your wealthy alums? That's right.
That's right.
As I am aware that we're coming close to the end of our time, I want to ask each of you to give us some closing thoughts. You know, I'm imagining myself as a participant. It's been a joy to be in conversation with you in this way. But if I had signed up, I would have been wondering, you know, what are they going to tell me that might really help me with my vision or my plan for sustainability in this very difficult moment in higher education. And I think I'm hopeful that the conversation in itself has been helpful, though I can also imagine someone might say, it's just getting harder. What words of encouragement? I'm going to be, closing thoughts, but encouraging closing thoughts. What words of encouraging closing, what words of encouragement might you offer our participants in the time we have left?
Well, I'll grant it is getting harder. That they're not wrong. In the realm of philanthropy, I would suggest the most important thing you can do is have a very clear sense of what your values are as an institution, what your mission is, and how you're going to achieve that mission, and then listen to what your potential donor cares about. What are their values? What are their philanthropic priorities? What is their philanthropic mission? And when you really listen, as opposed to just trying to tell them why they should give to you, you're much more likely to find a connection that's going to result in the gift and not just a gift.
Great. Thank you, Penelope. Ted?
So I think the most transformational thing that we can all do is the same thing we've been doing, but better. So let's do so it's much cheaper to retain a customer than it is to get a new one. So retention matters.
Yes.
Alumni who are happy and successful are more likely to give. So let's do that. Make sure they complete, make sure that they are equipped and conversant on how to get a job. And let's stay in touch with them, whether it's through engagement activities or continuing education. They will also then be more likely to give. And finally, how do you change the narrative about higher education, whether it's in your community or nationally, is you have a bunch of people who are really satisfied with what happened to them.
Yeah.
Well, that is a great way to end, I think, because we know the work we do is powerful. And to the extent that our graduates, the numbers of them increase, so it's not just the 60%, but the closer to 100% are out telling the story, the better it will be for all of us. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to Ali for making this webinar possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.